Without further ado, I offer you Dave and Peter.
Thank you, Jim. My name is Peter Fleming. I'm counsel to the Colorado River District in Glenwood Springs. Dave and I have done a talk on the cooperative agreement a couple of times now, but we were asked to do it a little bit differently today because instead of giving a detailed overview of the proposed agreement, we're going to talk a little bit about the agreement itself, but also talk about some of the issues that have come up during what we call the implementation phase of the agreement. As Jim mentioned, the agreement still is a proposed agreement, has not yet been executed, and we're working with a whole bunch of stakeholders, the state of Colorado, other water users on how best to implement the agreement. So I will give a quick intro to the agreement itself. Dave is going to be kind enough to talk to us about he's volunteered to write a book, I think, and he'll give us some insight on that. That's just a map of the geography that we're dealing with. I think everybody here is familiar with that. Map of the main stem of the Colorado River Basin. Of course, most of you have seen similar maps or this map before. This one shows the red triangles that you see on the right-hand side of the map at the Continental Divide or Trans Mountain Diversion projects. Diverting water out of the main stem of the Colorado River Basin. That's a lot of arrows, Dave. In any case, the agreement is it's historic. It really is an incredible accomplishment that we've come together, even though it has yet to be executed. We're working cooperatively to implement it, and it does represent a new way of looking at water development. I think hopefully this will go down as sort of Model A as to how Colorado can deal with the future water development in the state. This talks about when we made the agreement public. A number of parties are expected to sign, upwards of 35, I think Jim said, on the west slope. And again, we're working on the implementation phase. Before I talk about the respective interests that are in the agreement and represented throughout the agreement, and by the way, it has been publicly released. It's on our website. It's on Denver Water's website. So if you come back after this conference, you look at it, you want to have any questions, I'm sure Dave would be happy to answer all of them, but I'd be happy to answer any that you have as well. So please do that, because we'll only be able to touch on really the highlights today. But what brought us together? And we have these incentives, these interests that we wanted to promote through the agreement, and that was all well and good. But there was some outside pressure as well. One of those things was that Denver has a remaining conditional portion of its Roberts Tunnel water right. It's a tunnel at the bottom of Dillon Reservoir. It's one of Denver's primary sources of water supply. It comes out of the Blue River, obviously. And it filed an application to make absolute an additional component of its Roberts Tunnel water right. And that raised, with the River District, some legal questions that had been long-standing, and we thought, well, if the court enters a ruling on that case and we don't get resolution of these issues, we could be potentially prejudiced in the future. And so while we were talking, we were also actively litigating. It got to the point at one time where we kind of had to decide, are we going to litigate or are we going to talk? Because the litigation became increasingly expensive and acrimonious. But it did provide that incentive. We obviously decided to talk. It did provide that incentive for us to come back and knuckle down on the agreement itself, try to, as best we could, and as much leeway as the federal court would give us, put the litigation on the back burner, and that's what we did. So you'll see there, Denver has an interest of resolving the Blue River Decree, and we talk about West Slope interests. We also had an interest of resolving Blue River Decree issues. What were those issues? Really briefly, one of the provisions in the Blue River Decree provides that Denver shall use its Blue River water in the Denver metropolitan area only. Okay, that's all well and good, but what does the Denver metropolitan area mean? Well, it says that area that was reasonably integrated with the city and county of Denver. Well, that helps a little, but not a lot. Again, this decree was entered in 1955, and so we had a little bit of a tiff going back and forth with Denver as to exactly where it could use its Blue River water. Why was that important to the West Slope? Of course, if Denver serves its Blue River water way, way far out in the suburbs, that presents an additional draw on the Blue River, has adverse impact on junior West Slope water development. So we both wanted to resolve that issue. West Slope wanted some certainty as to how much Denver was going to draw, what areas it was going to serve on the Front Range. Denver wanted some certainty as to, hey, if we're going to serve X community with water, we don't want 10 years from now or 5 years from now the federal court to issue an order saying you can't do that anymore. So that's one of the big incentives in the agreement. Denver also, after the drought of 2002 and through some planning that Dave was in charge of, determined that it really had a significant shortfall in its ability to serve the north end of its system. And therefore came up with what it's calling a Moffett System Improvement Project, which it proposes to enlarge Gross Reservoir on the Front Range on South Boulder Creek that will provide an additional space for Denver to store water that it diverts out of the Fraser system in Grand County. Of course, that caused some, also some additional legal concerns. So here are the key provisions. They implement these interests that we've just talked about. You know, I'm just noticing that this PowerPoint, I think, came from Denver. I can tell because D is before C down there on the bottom, Dave. So I've gone through this again, but before, but I was a little confused by that. And now we know your branding. Denver will provide a significant amount of money, and it's not just a blank check. It's money for water infrastructure, water stream improvement projects, provide environmental flow water, both within Grand County, and put some limits, important limits on its ability to curtail its bypass flows on the Fraser and on Dillon Reservoir on the Blue River. Denver also allows for future consumptive use in Grand and Summit counties. A small amount of water for consumptive use goes a long way in Grand and Summit counties, but because Denver has such large capacity facilities and such senior water rights, it's very difficult, if not impossible, without Denver's cooperation to let junior water development for the resort community, snowmaking, residential uses, golf courses, develop unless Denver facilitates that. Denver will agree to limit its future projects on the West Slope to cooperative projects. In other words, they're not going to come and say, announce we're building this and you know, you guys do what you can to fight it back. They're going to say, we'd like to do this. Can we figure out a way to do it cooperatively? And if it doesn't work cooperatively, it probably doesn't happen. Denver will agree to support a Shoshone outage protocol. So when that power plant goes down, which it's 100+ years old, it does have problems, rock slides in the canyon, big trees getting caught in the diversion works and at high peak runoff periods. Denver and the River District, and we're hoping a number of other water users, will operate their systems as though the power plant is operating and its water right is calling. That has created some interesting discussions on how best to implement that provision. How do you protect water that is released or bypassed during a low flow period that would not otherwise have to be released because there's no downstream senior call? There would have been had the plant been operating, but if the plant's not operating and not calling, how do you protect that water that is released from diversion by others? So that's one of the struggles that we're working on right now. Green Mountain and the WISE project, Dave will talk about that. I talked briefly before about the West Slope abstention. In addition to this surcharge that Denver's going to place on folks that get its water, that currently don't receive water from Denver, those folks, when they sign on to use Denver's water, will agree to abstain from developing new water supplies from the West Slope. Within Water Division 5 above Grand Junction, that abstention provision is permanent. You sign on to get 5,000 acre-feet of water, you're not coming back to develop new water from Water Division 5 above Grand Junction. Outside of Water Division 5 above Grand Junction, that abstention is is temporary. So for a period of 25 years, if you sign up to use Denver's water, you're going to agree that you will not develop new supplies from the Gunnison River Basin, Water Division 4, or the Yampa White in Division 6. And what would be downstream of here, probably just a pump, you know, the big straw that we heard discussed earlier today, for a period of 25 years. And that period can fluctuate up and down based on progress that we make on, or lack thereof, on a future cooperative project. One of the big things that Denver's going to get out of this is that the West Slope parties will not oppose the Moffett Collection System project. They have some localized opposition as well, but I think addressing the opposition in the backyard of where the diversions are taking place is a significant benefit for Denver. I've talked about the outage protocol. Here's the map a little bit. I'm going to turn it over to Dave, and hopefully, I know I've sped through this really fast. I think some of you may have heard this presentation on the cooperative agreement again before, but I know not all of you have. So if there are questions, we're happy to answer them. Hopefully we'll have enough time. I did want to say, Dave, in recognition of Dave making the effort to come out here to Grand Junction, and of the progress we have made, we want to give him an official River District button down. So when you come for future presentations, you can come with the proper uniform, okay? Thank you.
Well, that was a surprise. I do want to point out, for those of you in the front row, a mistake, because my name card here says Dave Little, Colorado River District. And although through this negotiation and the agreement that we reached, we have developed friendships and learned a lot about each other, you have to do that in order to get where we got to. I don't work for the River District. I do work for Denver Water, and I am the Director of Planning. I was asked to talk today, not so much about the agreement, because as Peter mentioned, it is on our websites, and I encourage you to read it because it is very comprehensive, and I do believe it's historic, and I was proud to be part of it. But I was asked to think about what are some of the lessons that we learned getting to this point and through the negotiations. So last night when I was thinking about what I was going to talk about today, I thought, well, you know, lessons learned are probably something that you would read about in a book. And I think that there will be a book written about what we did. So my theme is the book in the future that I think is going to be written on this agreement. So first of all, you have to think about what the title might be. So the title I came up with is Overcoming Fear and Loathing, which is pretty appropriate when you're a part of these negotiations. But it has a subtitle too, and that is They Are Human, which was also critical for all of us to understand that the people across the table were human. They just weren't some kind of evil entities. And of course, the author of this book is going to be Eric Kuhn, I'm sure, because Eric is pretty prolific. So chapter 1, it's the history of demonizing each other. For many years, both organizations, the River District and Denver and Grant County and Eagle County and Summit County and Mesa County and Garfield County and a host of others, we demonized each other. We worked very hard at figuring out ways to point out why the other side was wrong, why their values were wrong, and why our values were right. There was many battles. A lot of people in the audience may not recognize that Northern and the River District at one time were allied against Denver. And there was historic battles that occurred with lots of bloodletting and a lot of animosity among the entities. That has changed in the recent time. There was many protracted court battles with lots of money spent and lots of bad will generated among entities, because when you're in a court battle, it's a zero-sum game. Someone loses, someone wins. Unfortunately, from Denver's perspective, we lost most of them. Then there was the Two Forks Project, which I view the Two Forks Project as more of a beginning than an end. Of course, Denver didn't get the Two Forks project, but it made us recognize that we had to look at a broader picture. We had to look at issues related to the West Slope and our impacts to the West Slope, and that was critical for us to evolve like that. And it brought the West Slope together to start to think about, from a common standpoint, what is important to the West Slope. So for the first time, I think, we started to think about the future and how we could start to work together coming out of the Two Forks effort. So that brings us to chapter 2. We start to rewrite the history as the interests begin to understand each other. And that happened not with the beginning of these negotiations. It happened with things like the Wolford Mountain Reservoir negotiations, where a lot of us sat down across the table, Eric Kuhn, myself, and others, Northern Denver, the River District, to work out an arrangement on Wolford Mountain Reservoir to get it constructed for benefits both to the East Slope and to the West Slope. In sitting down and talking with each other and understanding the issues from each other's perspective, we grew to respect and understand the importance of those issues, and we just started to develop relationships. And relationships are what successful negotiations are all about. The Clinton Reservoir-Fraser River Agreement was the second one where we worked very hard at figuring out how to find common ground on issues that were important to people in Summit County and Grand County and to Denver Water. All these went to helping us understand the issues among ourselves and to recognize the importance of issues for the people sitting across the table. The Upper Colorado River Study, which was a milestone in my opinion, where people from Grand County, Summit County, Denver, the River District, Northern, and many others sat down and tried to develop a common base of knowledge, common models we're going to use, common understanding of what the issues were that we're facing. And again, this went more towards helping us understand what the issues were, what all the issues were, and to break us out of our parochial thinking, because you have to move from that parochial thinking. Lesson learned. You have to listen to the other side and listen to other people. Listen to what their issues are. And you have to do more than listen. You have to understand from their perspective. Too often we filter what we hear through our own perspective, and that doesn't get you where you need to get. You need to understand the issue from their perspective, because it's critical in order for you to be creative in helping solve their issues. That's the only way you can be successful in these negotiations. It has to be a win-win for everyone. If it's a zero-sum game, someone wins, someone loses, you're going to go to court. And that's exactly what we were trying to avoid. Chapter 3, technicians, warriors, and statesmen. There are many warriors in this mediation. They had names like Glenn, Barney, Patty, Mark, Lurleen, and they did fight. And there were many others, and there were a lot of fights, and there was a lot of bloodletting throughout the mediation and throughout the negotiations. But what was interesting is to see how they started to coalesce and started to work in a common direction, how we all started to coalesce and work in a common direction. Even the warriors started to move in that common direction. And then the Colorado River interests got together and came up with a common approach. They were mostly all together. As I understand it, that happened over several meetings on the West Slope, where numerous people and interests got together from the headwaters all the way down to the Grand Junction area and came together on a common position on how they wanted to negotiate with Denver. As far as I know, that had never happened before. And one of the lessons learned for me that came out of that is there is not a single West Slope. Denver in the past has always said the West Slope this, the West Slope that. There is not a single West Slope. I learned that ski areas don't always have the same interest as agricultural community. I learned that Grand County doesn't always have the same interest as Mesa County. So that was a major milestone, is for the West Slope to come together in a united way to talk to Denver about what was necessary for this agreement to be successful. So one of the lessons learned is to be successful requires statesmen on both sides of the issues that are willing to work towards common good. And these statesmen did. And there were some women involved in this too. It's just statesmen is just a general term that I'm using. But they rose above the warriors. The warriors tended to defend positions which warriors are supposed to do. That's what they're hired to do. The statesmen had to step above that, and get above that, and come to common ground based upon what's good for Colorado, not necessarily what's good for the individual entities. And I was very proud of all the statesmen that participated in this and all the decision makers that participated in this discussion. It would not have occurred if they had not participated. Another lesson that we learned is you have to have individuals on each side of the discussion continually fight the desire to demonize the other side. Because there are mistakes made, there are miscommunications, there are things that people think about that they inject into the discussion that are called constantly piling on. And the quick, easy way for people to gravitate to is to demonize. They're not being sincere. They're setting us up. They're gouging us. If you allow that negative concept to get into the discussions, you'll fail. There needs to be people on both sides that will require and insist that you can get past that and move back to looking for that common ground. Chapter 4. I think I'm at chapter 4, yes. Agreeing is only half the journey. We reached agreement on all the value that we were exchanging among the parties in September of 2010. It is now a year later, and not one person has signed this agreement, even though we all support it. And the obvious question is, why haven't we signed it? Another lesson learned. Assuring you can implement an agreement as complex as this agreement takes considerable time. The biggest issue we're dealing with right now is implementing the agreement and implementing all the components that we agreed to. Peter mentioned a couple of them, and I'm going to go into a little more detail. But unless we can assure that we implement what we've agreed to, then people whose benefit is at risk, they don't get that benefit. And if they don't get the benefit, then the agreement fails. The environmental flows are a classic example. Denver agreed to forego diversions of 1,000 acre-feet in the Fraser River for environmental purposes. And physically, that's relatively easy for us. We just don't divert it. The hard part becomes, how do you assure that that water stays in the river all the way through Greene County and provides an environmental benefit for the county? That's what the county bargained for. From Denver's perspective, we fulfilled our obligation and we're just going to release it. But Greene County didn't get the value of the bargain unless we could figure out how to shepherd that water through the entire county. So we've been working on that issue, and it's very complex. But we have people from the state, we have people from the River District, from all the people that participated in the agreement working on some pretty creative approaches on the environmental flows. I'm going to talk about them in a second. And the Shoshone Protocol is another one that Peter mentioned. Denver agreed to participate and to abide by the Shoshone Outage Protocol, but that's not enough for the West Slope. Because although Denver is a significant contributor to the issue related to the Shoshone Protocol, we're not the only one. The Bureau has a significant component, and so does Northern. So we need to work with those two entities to assure that they too are part of the Shoshone Outage Protocol. And as you might imagine, there's some frustration in some of the Denver folks because they're people we can't control. They're not part of the mediation. But it's critical from the West Slope's perspective that those people be brought into the discussion. One of the things that this brings out is the level of creativity that's necessary to deal with all these issues. You can't be creative in these negotiations if you're in a defensive posture or if you've demonized the other side. And if you can't have the creativity, if you can't be creative, you can't solve these difficult problems. The environmental flow issue is a classic example. We now are constructing with the state and the River District and Greene County and Denver, and there's a host of people involved through very creative thinking. We're going to file a junior water right on one of Denver's reservoirs, Gross Reservoir. It's going to be a joint filing between Denver, Greene County, and the River District. That's never happened before. And we're going to use that junior water right to allow us to change the color of the water that we're going to release from our facilities in the Fraser River so that it is decreed for in-stream flow purposes. And then we're working with the state engineer's office, who also has been very creative, and the Colorado Water Conservation Board, who has also been very creative, to figure out how to shepherd that water through the county. I don't know of a place in Colorado or in the history of water, but that's been done before. And that's something that I think we all ought to be proud of. Lesson learned. Successful implementation of complicated water agreements requires historic levels of creativity by all involved. In this case, it's the state of Colorado, Northern Bureau, and all the parties to the agreement. It's phenomenal, the level of creativity that we're seeing in this agreement. In fact, a second lesson learned is, if you're patient, even water rights attorneys can be creative. Now, I don't say that in a derogatory sense for my friends that are water rights attorneys, but water rights attorneys are trained to be defensive and to attack. If you're in that posture, you cannot be creative. But if you're patient with the water rights attorneys and you allow their natural creativity to shine, they help. And the state engineers and the Attorney General's office is a classic example. We've had some very creative thinking coming out of the Attorney General's office and the state engineer's office. We need more, and we're confident that they're going to provide it, but that's something that I haven't seen in these kinds of areas. So the epilogue to this book that I thought about last night is many more lessons will be learned as we grow this new relationship between the east slope and the west slope of Colorado. And I want to highlight the word grow, because I don't view this as a culmination of 5 years of negotiation with a successful agreement. I view this as the beginning of a new relationship between the east and west slope. And if we work together and we can get rid of the demonization, get rid of the zero-sum games that we tend to fall into, we can tackle these very tough issues that you've been hearing about in this conference, like climate change, which is going to affect all of us. A potential of a compact call, which is going to affect all of us. And working on the endangered species in the environment, which is going to affect all of us. So that's the charge to this group, is that we put down our parochial views and we put down our traditional approach to water, and we come together. And I think this agreement and the diverse group of people that negotiated this agreement is proof that if you do that, you can do some pretty amazing things. Peter, you want to add?
And you got a shirt out of it too, Dave.
Right.
Not sure where Jim is, but I think we have time for some questions.
Questions?
One thing I wanted to state while if people are thinking of a couple of questions is Dave mentioned the West Slope effort to put together a comprehensive approach to negotiations with Denver, and Dave mentioned that we got together over several meetings to do that. Well, several times, many. And some of those meetings were as equally difficult and acrimonious as the meetings when we finally started meeting with Denver. So it was quite an effort just to get the West Slope on the same page in order to approach Denver. But once we did, we were committed to that. And that was an important part of the negotiations with Denver. Grand County said, hey, the interests that the Grand Valley entities are seeking to obtain through this negotiation, they're as equally as important to us as they are to the Grand Valley, and vice versa. And I think that was an important part of the negotiation.
And those of you that think that Denver speaks with a single voice, many times we do. But I can tell you that there were many meetings where there was lots of blood left on the ground with internal people at Denver Water working through these very tough issues. So even though it was just one entity, there was many opinions that we had to work through within our organization.
We have a question.
First of all, I want to congratulate the entities that have come together I want to thank Peter and Dave personally because they have put a lot of effort into this. I also want to thank you for the kind words you've said with respect to the state. It's been, I haven't always heard those words in public, and I do appreciate the recognition. But being the cynical water lawyer that I am, and hearing the questions that have come my way, I'd like to hear the response from both of you, and that is, have you just turned the prior appropriation system in our state law on its head?
Thank you, Jennifer. I thought you gave up the cynical lawyer hat when you took the job as the head of the Colorado Water Conservation Board. But it's a great question, and we really have struggled. The CWCB, the State Engineer's Office, the Attorney General's Office have been very creative in trying to help us work through this agreement. That doesn't mean there has not been frustrations where we say, why can't we just do this like this? And the state will say, well, maybe you could, but here's an issue that might arise in the future where you wouldn't, something might arise that might thwart the intent of what you're trying to do. So we have continued to work with the state. I don't think that we are turning the prior appropriation system on its head. And to the contrary, I think we're using the prior appropriation system and its inherent flexibility, that's been built into it throughout the years as it evolves, to best implement this agreement and to use that appropriation system to actually protect the environmental flows that Dave was mentioning. It's a difficult process, as the members of the Water Conservation Board learned yesterday at their meeting here in Grand Junction when they were first presented with some of the decisions that they're going to have to be making about how to implement the agreement, that there will be some unique thinking that has to take place.
And don't mistake my question, because it is unique thinking, and I think it's been very positive. And Peter, you answered it the way I've been answering that question. But I thought there's got to be a lot of people sitting here having that thought. Besides protecting the environment, I think you are doing a good job of making sure no other water rights are injured in that process. So it does keep together the very basic tenets of our water law system, I think. I didn't mean to set you up. It was really
thank you. Well, just by way of example, Dave talked a little bit about the environmental flows, and I talked a little bit about Shoshone, but let me talk about one of the other sides of the Shoshone issue. As Dave mentioned, both Denver and the River District will operate their facilities effectively as though the Shoshone call is on when it's not, which means that Denver, which diverts water out of the Fraser system, whether it's in priority or not, if it's diverting, 40 CFS out of the Fraser system when, under normal conditions, when there's a Shoshone call on the river, instead of stopping diverting that water, it historically will release an equivalent amount from its Williams Fork Reservoir. And so downstream of Williams Fork, the river's the same. Shoshone gets its water that's entitled to, but Denver diverts. Under an outage protocol, Denver could just divert the water from the Fraser and keep water, not release it from the Williams Fork in the absence of this protocol. In addition thereto, Denver would be entitled to store water to the extent it was coming into Williams Fork Reservoir. But it's not going to do that either, because that would defeat the purpose of the outage protocol. So how, when there's not a call on the river, do we operate our systems in a way to replicate river flows as though the call was on the river? We talked about shepherding water that's released from the reservoir downstream, but how do we not get penalized for Denver bypassing water that, under strict application of the priority system, it's in priority to divert into Williams Fork Reservoir? If it had space in Williams Fork Reservoir, it could take that water, but for its pledge to operate under the Shoshone outage protocol.
I only had one last comment, and that was I told my board yesterday that every time I hear Denver in the River District talk, I hear that old song from Fifth Dimension, Age of Aquarius. Congratulations, guys.
Thank you.
We have another question.
Yeah, in water time, once you decided to proceed with your rights and develop this agreement, City of Denver, how many years or were we talking to for just a frame of when the ideas were to proceed with this agreement, and how long did it take?
I believe we actually started thinking, I think the genesis of this agreement began with the Wolford Mountain Agreement, myself, because that's where we started to first discuss working together on and solving common problems. And that was, when was that, 1993 or something like that? 86? Thank you, Eric. See, I always like to have Eric around because he's my encyclopedia of knowledge. 1986. So it's been a long time coming. The negotiations specific to this agreement, I think, were about, how many years, Eric? 5 years. 5 years, maybe 6 years, and really intense in the last 3 years. And we fully expect to have this executed by the end of the year. That's our goal.
I can tell you that in Summit County, the reaction to the agreement was very, very positive. We'd stayed in close contact with the water districts, the towns, the county all worked very closely together. And I believe that is the same reaction, I believe, James, in Grand County and others that I've talked to. Dave, what I haven't heard is, so far, what's the reaction in City and County of Denver and maybe some of the surrounding areas? That
was Gary Martinez, county manager for Summit County, who was also went through some of the brain damage in the negotiations. We're hearing not only positive things from our customers. Mostly, we always have some of our customers that wonder, you know, why'd you do this or why'd you do that? But generally, positive things. Our customers have a pretty strong environmental ethic, and so the environmental components of this are playing well. We have run into some interesting criticism from people that are other water providers on the Front Range, that maybe we've set the bar too high. And now they will be required to be equally as giving, if you will, or creative in solving issues. So we've taken some criticism on that maybe we've gone too far over to the River District side.
I heard the other day that we set the bar too low. So. Yeah. Don't
wear the shirt in Denver.
Well, I'll wear the shirt anywhere. There's one thing that I think I mentioned earlier, but you can't go through a negotiation like this and not develop friendships and respect for the people that you're working with, and we've all done that. So I feel very comfortable during the rollout of this agreement with the governor when I wore the Grand County EMS sweatshirt that James gave me for my birthday, and I'll be very proud to wear this Colorado River District shirt whenever I can.
Just not at the office Halloween party.
Anytime.
Any more questions? Oh, one over here.
Yeah, Dave, I really appreciate your comments. You have a sage perspective already just at the end of this, and maybe you should write that book. Could you talk a little bit, Peter and Dave, about the relationship of implementation of this and getting signatures? If you don't get all the signatures, or you get signatures with half of them have signing notes or whatever you want to call it, everyone's got their little bit to add in, or, well, yes, but if, and whatnot. It seems this is a working document, and the parties are already moving forward on implementing it as best as possible in good faith. How important is it to get all the signatures?
From a West Slope perspective, I think it's critical to get all of the signatures, and been a little bit of time since I've looked at it, but I think it basically says by itself, the agreement, that it's not effective until all of the parties that are listed on it have executed it. you raise a great question about the struggle between working on the implementation and when you execute. Dave mentioned that as well. It just comes down to how certain are people, how comfortable are they, I guess is a better way to put it, that the agreement is moving forward as it is intended to move forward, and they're going to get the benefit that's contemplated. You know, we've talked about at times, well, nothing occurs until everything occurs, and as logical as that might seem, a way to structure it, practically it just doesn't work that way. So there's risks that I think everybody takes in coming in to execute the agreement. Dave mentioned a deadline, or a hoped deadline of the end of this year for execution by all the parties. I'm hopeful that we can reach that as well. We got some tough work to do before we do that, and a lot more meetings.
But one thing that's significant is that all the people that were at the negotiation table are now united in working towards that goal. So no longer are we negotiating against each other or across the table. We're on the same side of the table working towards implementation.
Any final questions? Time for one more.
Thank you all for your great work. I'm just curious about where we are in terms of the Shoshone outage protocol, what needs to be accomplished, and where you think, how you think that will be accomplished, and some timelines.
I think we have a meeting set next week.
Couple weeks.
Next couple weeks? Is that what it is?
Well, we do have a meeting next week, but we have a specific Shoshone meeting in a couple of weeks coming.
So we're meeting frequently on trying to get through those issues. I think it boils down to two issues. One is making sure that all the players are signed on, that we get a commitment from the Bureau, we get a commitment from Northern, and I think that those are all in process, and I think that we're going to be successful there. And then also working with the state to make sure that we can implement the Shoshone outage protocol in the way it's envisioned. So there's two components there, and we are working on both fronts. In order for the agreement to be signed, I think we're going to have to be successful on both of those fronts, and I'm still confident that we're going to be all signing before the end of the year.
Let me just add a couple more thoughts to that. Thanks, Dave. You know, we talked a lot about the creative thinking that's gone in to date on implementation of the environmental flows in Grand County, the bypass flows that Dave talked about. That's 1,000 acre-feet of bypass and potentially more from Williams Fork Reservoir as well. And while there's tremendous progress has been made there, it's taken a lot of time to get to the point we have. And we've basically not exclusively, but worked consistently on that since we publicly unveiled this agreement in April. And here we are in September, and you know, there's a clear path forward as to how that's going to be accomplished. What that's meant, though, is that we haven't spent the equivalent amount of time on implementation of the Shoshone outage protocol. Mm-hmm. That's our next step, at least in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, let's have a hand for our panel.
Thank you.